Hello, I've called this lecture How to Begin to Read a Poem because obviously I can't tell you in 15 minutes how to read a poem, and obviously it depends on the poem, but I would like to just give you a few pointers, a few things to look for, mainly technical, when looking at any poem that might allow you to start to say interesting things about it. And the poem I want to look at is called Scaffolding by Seamus Heaney. It's from his first collection. It's not actually in his selected poems. I think it should be a bit better known than it is, although it is often recited at Irish weddings. Masons, when they start upon a building, are careful to test out the scaffolding, make sure that planks won't slip at busy points, secure all ladders, tighten bolted joints. And yet, all this comes down when the job's done, showing off walls of sure and solid stone. So if, my dear, there sometimes seem to be old bridges breaking between you and me, never fear. We may let the scaffolds fall, confident that we have built our wall. So, this is a poem written fairly early on in Heaney's relationship with his wife, Marie. The story is that he produced this poem for her after they'd had a row. And you can see the basic idea of the poem. It's don't worry about a few poles that come clattering down because we've built the solid walls of our relationship. But I don't want to focus too much on the meaning or the content of this poem, because I think that's often where people go wrong with poetry, is they try and reduce it to its meaning or its content. And it's almost the definition of a poem that it isn't paraphrasable. Now that's a lovely little idea, isn't it? Comparing a relationship with building something and setting up the scaffolding. But if that was all it was, it perhaps wouldn't amount to that much. A poem isn't just reducible to its meaning. And in that sense, it's really just like a song. Think about your favourite songs or your favourite song lyrics. Maybe it's about somebody breaking up with someone. Well, there are millions of songs about heartbreak and breakups. What makes that song special to you is that it's much more mysterious than its meaning. It's about the music, it's about the sound and shape of the words, and that is true of poetry as well. A poem is also music, and what it's saying is how it is saying it, and those two things are inextricably interlinked. So the very first thing you need to do with any poem is what I just did then, which is read it aloud. Because it's got to feel like a voice, and all the great poems do sound like that. They sound like somebody's voice speaking to you, and they have a very particular tone. You're able to hear it in your head, and even if you're reading something silently, you can always hear the sound and shape of the words in your head. So read it out, and read it out again, and perhaps even memorize it. And the next thing you need to do is look at it. Any form of writing is a visual medium. It's marks on the page or marks on the screen. And the first thing you notice about that poem, which is also true of many poems, is that there's not very much there. It's 10 lines, 5 stanzas, and when that poem was published in his first collection, Death of a Naturalist, it would have just looked like a block of text surrounded by the white sea of the blank page. And that is how many poets think of poems. A poem is an interruption of silence. When you're writing really bad poetry, as I used to do when I was a teenager, you're just saying too much often. You're just trying to get all your emotions out on the page. And often really good poetry is struggling to say something. It's actually reluctant to say something often. And what the poem doesn't say also matters. poets use white space, and it's as important to them, or perhaps nearly as important, as the words. The words and the spaces in between them come into a relationship. Now, because there's not much there, things like the first line is really important, and the first lines of many poems are important because they just start, they set a tone, they are a voice speaking to you. Masons, when they start upon a building, are careful to test out the scaffolding. Hang on, who is this person? Who is this person just talking to me about masons, and why are they talking about masons? And in fact, you don't get a sense until the fourth stanza who he's addressing. So if my dear, so he's addressing someone he loves. But you don't know that until then. It just kind of starts. So think about that with any poem. How does the first line address the reader and draw them into the poem? What voice or tone does it suggest? Now, the other thing about a lot of poems, in memorable poems, is that they are based on striking images, and that is a very cinematic image, isn't it? You can actually see the wall being built and all the scaffolding being set up and coming down. People often think that poems are about their meanings, or they're about feelings. They're about the feelings of the poet. But often they're about images. Often they're about setting up a really strong visual sense in the reader's mind. And when they are about meanings and feelings, they often make sense of those feelings through images, because that's really what a metaphor does. That's what a metaphor is. It's basically trying to make something abstract, like a feeling, into something concrete and visible. The next thing we need to talk about is the meter, because poems are rhythm. They are shaped sound, just like a song. So meter just means the number of stresses or beats in the line, and this is in very loose iambic pentameter. If you've not come across that term before, it essentially means there are 10 syllables in the line, and the stress is on the second syllable. That's why it's called pentameter. There are 5 stresses. So it's didum, 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 didum. And the best way to do that is just to read out the line and count on your fingers the number of times you stress a syllable. So a pentameter is 5 stresses. There we go. Make sure that planks won't slip at busy points. Secure all ladders, tighten bolted joints. And you can see I've put the stresses in that second stanza in bold. But the reason I've done it with the second stanza is actually a lot of the other stanzas don't really work iambically. An iamb means that the stress is on the second syllable. So that's another thing to look at with a poem. If there is a metrical pattern, how regular is it? Look for the patterns of expectation that are created by that meter and then disrupted. What makes a metrical poem interesting is often the irregularities. So you should think about when those irregularities appear and what they draw our attention to. So it's not masons when they start upon a building, it's mason. So the stress is on the first syllable. So it's starting the poem strongly. When it says secure all ladders, tighten bolted joints, that is an iambic pentameter, but there's a comma in the middle, so there's a little bit of a pause. So it's a bit like going up and down a hill. Secure all ladders, tighten bolted joints. And then you may have noticed when I read the poem, I paused after and yet, all this comes down. So if, my dear, because there's a comma there, and then never fear, the stress is on the nev, the stress is on the first syllable. So a poem is actually boring if you just say it all in iambic line. Masons, when they start upon a building, are careful to test out the scaffolding. You wouldn't say it like that. You'd say it just as somebody speaking, and the iambic line would be like a sort of backbeat of a song, a bit like the drum and bass. You can hear it in the background, but it's not dominating everything. The next thing to notice is the rhyme scheme. Rhymes bring words into relationship with each other. And this is a very simple rhyme scheme. It's in couplets. Now, the problem with that is it could make the rhyme scheme a little bit too pat and obvious. So Heaney musses it up a bit with rhyming done with stone, which is just a kind of half rhyme. And then building and scaffolding don't really rhyme, do they? It's just the last bit of the word with the ding. There are other ways in which Heaney makes the rhyme scheme less obvious to do with line breaks, which I will come to in a second. But really the rhyming in a poem is just one of the ways in which words are brought into relationship with each other. So look for other word shapes. So the obvious one is alliteration, sure and solid, stone. Bridges, breaking, that's not just the first letter B, it's also the second letter R. But then that's just the start of words, but then you can have similar sounding consonants at the end of words like start and test. So look for those kind of kernels of words as well as just the rhymes and as well as the alliteration. And you will also notice that the words are quite simple. They are monosyllabic, many of them, and they're often just not really poetic words, they're just very ordinary words. There are hardly any words there more than 2 syllables. I think it's just confidence and scaffolding that are more than 2 syllables. Now, when you have short words, you have fat vowel sounds, you have varied vowel sounds, because every monosyllabic word has one main vowel sound. So when you have lots of monosyllabic words, you'll be having very varied vowel sounds. And vowel sounds carry a lot of the emotional weight of a poem. I mean, it's no coincidence that the word, when you hurt yourself, you go ow, because it's a really fat vowel sound. And when you are really impressed with something, you go wow. Heaney uses those kinds of very varied and chewy vowel sounds. They make your mouth stretch a bit, like stone. Stone is a word that has quite a fat vowel sound. It actually appears an awful lot in poems. Showing, planks. If you've got a northern accent like me, then planks is a very fat vowel sound. Another thing to look for is verbs and verb forms, because verbs carry the energy of the poem. How do they move the poem along? Well, you'll notice that quite a lot of those verbs, which are in red there, are very active: start, test, tighten, secure. There's not an awful lot of linking verbs like to be or to have. Those ing words like showing, breaking, they are called participles. They are actually adjectives, but they have a verb hidden inside them: show, break, and that is also a way of giving verbal energy to the poem. The other thing to think about is the sentences. Poems are written in sentences, not just in line and meter. And you'll see that that poem is 3 sentences. And you'll see that the longest sentence is the first one in red, just kind of setting out the terms of the poem, and the shortest one in yellow is the end, which is the punch. That's the kind of message of the poem. So how does the poem vary long and short sentences? Because by doing that, you also create cadence and music. And also you set up a tension between the line and the meter and the rhyme scheme and the syntax, the sentence structure. And that's what makes a poem interesting often. What that also does when you have sentences as well as line and meter is that it creates interesting line breaks, because the syntax, the sense of the sentence goes on beyond the line. So a line break is like a little bit of mini punctuation. So have a think about those line breaks. Think about where a line breaks. And also that makes the rhymes often more interesting and less obvious. There sometimes seem to be old bridges breaking between you and me, never fear. So be and me is a fairly obvious rhyme, but because it's stretched by the sentence, it's not quite as obvious. So that's what makes a poem interesting often, is that tension between the syntax and the line in the meter. Okay, so that's just a few little pointers, and I hope you can use them when looking not just at Heaney's poetry but at other poems as well. Thanks for watching to the end. Thank you. Bye.